All right, here we are at the Abalone Farm. We're gonna do a tour here. And oh my gosh, there's a bald eagle chasing a gull around right now. Look at that. That's a bald eagle. That's pretty cool.
It's really going after.
All right. So first area we have over here are the holding tanks. So that boat that I showed you guys, the Ocean Rose, they drive that up over here, and then they use that crane to offload these giant bags of kelp. And they do about 5 tons twice a week. I'm just speaking in past tense because they shut down about 2 months ago. They used to do about 5 tons twice a week. And so they would offload the bags into this tank. It'd be full of salt water. That way it'd keep the kelp fresh. And then they would bring it up, throw it in the back of a pickup truck, chop it up with a square point shovel. And then these are the grow out tanks over here. So they basically just drive down these rows of the grow out tanks and shovel the kelp into the tanks individually. So they had about 30 to 35 employees here at any point in time, because there's just a tremendous amount of labor that's involved with growing these abalone. So we'll cruise down this direction here. There's basically 4 parts of the facility that we're going to be checking out today. The first part of the facility is the nursery area slash hatchery. So in this area is where they keep the brood stock, and they also are hatching out. So they were spawning the abalone here. Do you guys know how they spawn abalone?
Yeah.
What?
The core line out.
No,
I think they can do it that way. They can also do it with hydrogen peroxide.
Hydrogen peroxide, ding, ding, ding. So just like with urchins, you guys probably heard about urchins, you can force them to spawn. You can also do the same thing with abalone. So they'd have a big brood stock, and they would force them to spawn when they needed juveniles. These are some pretty old tanks here. They haven't used these tanks for years. These were the first grow out tanks that they had. As you can see, this farm has been here for quite a while. They formed it back in, there's that bald eagle again. Well, that's actually an osprey there. Yeah, that's an osprey there. Wow, all sorts of wildlife. So they started this place back in 1968, and they were one of the first abalone farms in the world, literally. And they pioneered a lot of the technology and knowledge on how to farm abalone. They weren't able to start selling abalone until 1974, and they really didn't get up to big production until about 1983. So up here we have the hatchery and the nursery, and let's see here. Yeah, so we'll walk around this other area here and get into the hatchery and the nursery. On the left side is the pump house. So this is really the first step in the whole process. Basically, they have a big pipe that goes out into the ocean. And it's just a little subtidal. And so they're sucking water all the way up to the top of the hill here. These tanks here are the initial settling tanks. Because they're pumps in the intertidal zone, subtidal zone, it can get lots of sediment stirred up in it. And so they need to have a little bit of settling before it goes out into the farm. Because if they just pumped water directly to all the tanks, they would get a lot of sediment accumulating in the tanks. These big round cylinders up here, those are sand filters. So the water would be pumped initially through those sand filters, and then these smaller tanks here are micro filters. And so they need to have really clean water before they run it through the farm. Otherwise it would fill up with silt, and it would also possibly introduce bacteria or maybe possibly pathogens and things like that that could be bad for the abalone. So coming around the corner here, so maybe the best place to start would be where they had the brood stock. So the brood stock are just larger, older sized abalone that they used for spawning. And their brood stock was both abalone that were from the farm, but they also would go up to the North Coast, Humboldt, Mendocino, and they would get wild abalone too. So they wanted to make sure that they kept the gene pool as broad as they possibly could. So by bringing in those wild abalone, when they spawned, they made sure that they were spawning with a broader gene pool as opposed to just continually using the farmed abalone over and over again. So normally these tanks would have been very full. The abalone were good sized abalone. They were between, probably 5 to 7 inches. So they were pretty good sized abalone. And those abalone, as you guys know, they grow really, really slow. So a 5 to 7 inch abalone could be anywhere from 10 to maybe even 20 years old. So they could keep the abalone for quite some time. And they were pretty happy living in here with no sea otters to harass them. So this is the... That caught me. All right. Trying to wear a mask here, and it's not the best. My glasses keep fogging up as we're walking around here. So this building over here on the left side, this was the hatchery slash spawning facility. And I think we can go in through here. Oh my goodness. All right. So lots and lots of tanks. So this is the area where they would initially spawn out and collect the eggs. As they're hatching out, they basically hatch out overnight, and they're very small. I think they're 120 microns. So they are incredibly small. And they stay in a larval stage for about a week. After a week, they settle out of their larval stage, and then they become a little abalone, basically. Well, anyway, so these buildings, they're cement. They're big, thick cement buildings, and what they're trying to do is keep the temperatures really steady and cool for the larval abalone. That's the most sensitive stage. And as they're larvae, they're just drifting around in these tanks for about a week until they start to settle out. Abalone are incredibly fecund. These abalone, these 5 to 7 inch abalone could literally lay several million eggs. And so the mortality rate is pretty high on them. So once they settle out, they're still incredibly small, but they actually start to develop a shell, and they put them in these tanks here. So initially they would put about 5 or 50,000 of these very small abalone in these tanks here. So this is the area where they would start to grow the abalone. Now, when they're that small, they can't eat kelp yet. And so they actually used to have to farm diatoms. Back when this farm was running, there was tubes that would run across here. And that's why they have this type of roofing material to let the UV light to come through. And these tubes would be literally full of brown diatoms. And then they would run a sponge through these tubes. And that was what the small abalone would eat. So these tanks were all full, and I don't know if you guys could see, but there are several floors of these tanks. So there's a lot of tanks in here, lots of tanks, and this building keeps going over in this direction too. So at any point in time, this farm had about 4 million abalone in it. So these are all tanks, more tanks, and yet more tanks. And if you look over this way, you have the same tanks. So they had an incredible production going on here with many millions of abalone in the farm at any one point in time. So the small abalone would stay in these tanks for about 3 months. At that point in time, they got large enough to where they could start eating algae. And as soon as they got large enough to start being able to eat algae, basically their mouth parts have to develop enough to where they can eat the algae. Then they would take them back over this direction and put them in these baskets. So we'll kind of head back this way. So we got the hatchery over here, the brood stock over here, and then this is the nursery area over here. When they put those 50,000 in the nursery tanks, in that 3-month period of time, when they finally get big enough to where they can start eating the kelp, then they're going to move them down here, but there'll probably be about 1,500 to 3,000 left at that time. That's just natural mortality that's occurring during that process. So once they get to be large enough to start eating kelp, they bring them down into these tanks here. These tanks would have had baskets in them, and the whole idea of the baskets is just to keep the small abalone from going down through the drains. So the pumps, once again, I want to walk over there, we can maybe look out there. Pumps are over this direction. I don't know if you guys know or have friends in agriculture, but pumping water is very, very expensive, and especially when you're pumping it up a steep hillside like this. Their monthly power bill was $50,000+ every single month. You can see the white pipe heading out into the ocean there. And as you can see, it's exposed a little bit. What's the tide today? Oh, it's a negative. It's not quite negative. So 1.5 is negative at 5:45. But 1.5 foot low tide, and the pipe is exposed a little bit. So actually it was quite a bit of work for those folks here. They would have to go out there, and at times when there was kelp that was dislodged, they would have to go and unclog the mouth of the pipe. They'd also get lots of organisms growing in the pipe, and so they're constantly having to go through the pipe and unclog it from mussels and barnacles and things like that would be growing in the pipe. Surfers, I don't know if you guys know about the Abalone break here. This is a pretty famous break along the coast. It's got to be pretty big for it to do it, but there's a reef out in that area right there. You can see that little bulge up right there. There's a really good wave that breaks right there, and the only way to access it is either have somebody that works here that you know, or you have to go in from Via Creek and hike and swim all the way out here, which people will do sometimes because it's a really good wave. So as you can see, these tanks are all kind of gravity fed. So they pump up the water to the upper tank, and then it's going to gravity feed down to each lower tank. And within these tanks would have been baskets. And because it's gravity flow and water's flowing through there, if you just had the abalone in there, they could have just been washed down possibly from one tank to the next. And these abalone in these tanks, you know, these were 1 to maybe 3 or so inches or so across, so they were pretty small. Actually, here's a bag right here, or a basket. So this is what the baskets look like right here. And then once they start feeding them kelp, of course the kelp has all sorts of stuff on it too, and so the kelp would bring in all sorts of organisms from the ocean. So they did have all sorts of things growing in here, and we could see all sorts of shells, mussel shells. Ooh, hey, here's a little abalone shell, it looks like. Oh,
So cute.
oh, there's another one. Hey, who says you're not going to get a souvenir from this? Yeah, so these are just little tiny baby abalone shells.
Oh, it's so cute.
Right, so that was about the size that they were getting into out of these grow out, or these aren't the grow out ones. These are the nursery ones. Yeah, normally when we would finish this trip, they had just literally piles of like these 4 to 6 inch abalone shells over there, and students could get 3 or 4 of them.
I have a bunch from diving, just grab them.
Oh, cool.
Well, they're dead already, but...
Just finding them. Yeah, it's a lot of, oh, here's a nicer size one here. Yeah, feel free to grab all those you want. There's,
Sweet.
I might grab that one. It was pretty sweet.
I was like, I'm sure they're sick of these shells.
Yeah, they don't need them anymore.
The bigger one right here.
So one of the things you can do, if you can see the sequence here, is that after it's gone through several tanks, they wouldn't send it on to the next tank, then they would start putting new water through. So they figured once it went through, I don't know how many it was, maybe 3 or 4 tanks, then perhaps a lot of the oxygen would build up, and perhaps there was a lot of fecal material build up, that then they would send that back out into the ocean, and then they would have new water come into the next series of tanks. So this would be where they would flush it back out into the ocean, and then they would have new water coming into these tanks here. Yeah, so all the abalone that they raised here, they didn't have any direct marketing out of the farm. So all the abalone that they raised were shipped to fish markets, restaurants, or other places. Most of their product went overseas, and that was one of the things that led to their demise, was that there was starting to be some farms developed in Southeast Asia, and most of their product was sent to Southeast Asia, and both lower labor costs and lower shipping costs forced them out. And so they have to be alive, right? So they had to ship them over there alive, so they had to air freight them. And as long as they got there in less than, I think it was 30 hours, they had like 99% survival. But once countries in Southeast Asia started producing abalone, they just couldn't compete with them. So the kelp harvester would launch out of Morro Bay, which is right over there, and they would come up and work along this coast. All that kelp that you see growing out there is a giant kelp, the Macrocystis. And the kelp harvester would come up and mow this kelp down. And they had to lease these beds from the state, but it was pretty cheap. I don't know the price of it, but it was actually fairly cheap. Oh, they still have shells over here. Cool, if you guys want to grab some of these bigger ones. Maybe just get like 3 or 4, just so we don't go crazy about it. But yeah, sorry you guys. Normally, if you were able to come on this field trip, you could have got some of these bigger shells too.
Oh my god. So there's like 3 other abalone farms in California, right?
Yeah, 1 Santa Barbara and 2 up around Santa Cruz.
Yeah, and there's a like scientific one at Bodega.
Yeah, and that's the one where they're really working with the white abalone, which is an endangered species.
I worked there 2 summers ago.
Oh, you did? Oh, cool. Yeah. How'd that go?
I worked on spawning abalone.
Oh, neat.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's why I knew.
Oh, yeah.
So do any of the farms like release them into the wild, or they only are doing it to sell them?
They're just doing it to sell them. They're not allowed to release them into the wild. Part of that is the genetic inbreeding component of that, possibly, and that's just not what they're there for. Although the lab you work for,
They released white abalone.
Yeah.
I think last summer.
Yeah. That was the first time?
Yeah, that was the first time.
Very cool.
They waited till they got about, I think, 3 years old.
Okay.
Because they put so much effort into it.
Yeah, crazy. So one of the reasons why abalone is so expensive, so this basically is the harvestable size abalone, and that abalone is between 4 and 6 years old, and you get 1 ounce of meat off of that thing. So that's why abalone goes anywhere from $100 to $150 a pound, because you have 30 to 35 employees, $50,000+ a month electric bill, and it takes 4 to 6 years for it to get 1 ounce of meat. So that's kind of nice.
Thank you.
That's cool. That's awesome. I like how they all fit together.
I need to think about it. It's so cool.
That is pretty cool.
So like the only thing they're doing for restoration of wild abalone is just not allowing commercial fishermen or recreational fishing of it?
Yeah, so they shut down. So it was always a weird delineation. 25 years ago, you could commercially harvest abalone south of San Francisco and do it scuba diving, which is cheating.
Yeah,
because if you've ever
that's
gone
what
after abalone.
Yeah, I know a lot of people that did that.
Yeah, and so they closed that down finally in 1997. They closed down any abalone harvesting south of San Francisco, and then they still had very healthy populations north, up in Mendocino, Humboldt County, all those areas. And that's because there's no otters up there, right? So there was healthy kelp forest, there was no otters, no predators, and so the abalone were very healthy up there. I went to Humboldt, back in late 90s, and it was just, go out into a garden and picking up snails. Literally you go out on the negative tide and just pick up 8-inch abalone all day long. It was awesome. But with one of those big El Nino events we have massive die-off of the kelps. I can't remember who watched that video about the urchin barrens up there developing, right? So the sea stars died off, the urchins proliferated, they eaten all the kelp, and they shut down sport harvesting of abalone in 2017. So now there is no more harvesting of abalone anywhere on the California coast.
How do they get them like commercially from those areas? Because I know like they're kind of hard to get off of rocks.
Yeah, so you use this thing called an ab iron. So it looks kind of like a tire iron, I guess.
Yeah.
It's flat, and the abalone, you know, are stuck to the side of a rock. And you have to go in pretty quickly, because if they suck down, it's even hard to get them off with the abalone iron, and you got to just jam that abalone iron in there and pop them off.
But they do that like commercially?
If you were
like,
commercially diving for them, they would be doing the same thing.
So that's the only way to get them is diving for them?
Well, when you used to be able to, yeah. My dad actually, my dad was a teacher here locally when I was growing up, and one summer he decided he was going to be a commercial abalone diver. This was back in the early 70s, and he did it for a whole summer. He said it was the hardest darn work he's ever done in his life. He almost died one time. He almost like shallow water blackout. His dad was on the boat and pulled him up because he blacked out underwater. And yeah, he just did it one summer.
Just the one summer.
Just the one summer. But we ate abalone like kings that summer, let me tell you. All right, so let's keep cruising along. You guys get enough shells there? Yeah, so back when this abalone farm was in production, they had about 4 million abalone in captivity at any one point in time, and they would produce or sell about 1 million abalone, which equaled about 100 plus tons a year. So a lot of abalone. You can see these tanks. These tanks go for a long way. There's a lot of tanks up here. I believe it's a half an acre of tanks. And so these are the grow out tanks. So these are the tanks where they would put the abalone. So they would move them from the area over there where we had the baskets and like the 1 to 3 inch or so abalone. Then they would bring them over into these grow out tanks, and this is where they would spend the last couple years of their life before they got to be marketable size. So as we see, lots of limpet shells, snail shells, and this was mostly brought in with the kelp. So this is when the area where they would drive down through the middle areas here, and they would have a truck full of kelp, and they would be chopping it up with a square point shovel, and they would be tossing it into these tanks. So these tanks would have been filled with abalone. So on the ends here was where the water would dump in. On the bottom you can also see that there's aeration tubes. So every 30 to 40 minutes, I believe it was, these aeration tubes would turn on, and it would help aerate the tanks to make sure they had enough oxygen. Whoa, look out. And so it would go through 3 big tanks, and by the time it got to this 3rd tank area, they would then drain this water back down into the ocean, and then they would start again with a new set of 3 tanks. So they tried to keep the water as fresh as they possibly could, flushing out the old water, flushing out the fecal material, and they had to flush this directly out into the ocean. There's no place else to put all this water. They were sucking in so much water. These tanks up here are a little bit newer, but still the same process is going on. So that's the hope here, is that there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure located out here, and it would be fantastic if Cal Poly and whoever else could be involved with this project to take this over and possibly make another white abalone hatchery or some other type of hatchery. You could grow oysters up here, you could grow clams up here, you could grow all sorts of things. And the new hire at Cal Poly, Kevin Johnson, he's going to play a big role in trying to get this going. But it's going to be a lot of money. I mean, this is millions of dollars just to upkeep this facility and to keep everything working here. So